Tonight, we uncover a truth so unsettling it was never meant to surface. A trail of secrets buried not in shadows, but in plain sight, not hidden by time, but by design. For centuries, the Vatican has stood as a symbol of light, but behind that light lies a darkness carefully maintained, a silence guarded by vaults no outsider may enter. This is not just about lost scrolls or forbidden texts, it is about the erasure of entire centuries, the manipulation of time itself, 1,000 years rewritten, scientific breakthroughs silenced, lives erased, knowledge delayed, not by war, but by will, and the ones who questioned it, silenced by fire or forgotten by history. Inside the heart of the Vatican is an archive so vast it holds more than just secrets. It holds the power to control memory, to rewrite reality, and to decide what humanity is allowed to remember. So, before you settle in thinking this is just another bedtime story, know this: the most terrifying secrets are the ones we were trained never to see. Take a breath, like the video, subscribe, because tonight we are stepping into the archive, and some pages were never meant to be read. You see him on balconies, waving to crowds, dressed in white robes, smiling, gentle, almost glowing. The Pope. To the world he is the voice of God on earth, a figure of peace, humility, and hope. Cameras flash, bells ring, hands reach out for his blessing. But what if that light is a distraction? What if behind the man in white, another figure stands, unseen, unquestioned, and far more powerful? This is not a story of good versus evil. It is a story of layers. The surface we are shown, and the shadows we are never meant to notice. Because behind every symbol of light, there is something casting it. Something darker, more calculated, and far older than most realize. Few know this, but the Vatican is not just a church. It is a sovereign state with its own bank, police force, laws, and intelligence network. And just like any government, it has a structure, a hierarchy. At the top, everyone sees the Pope. But step deeper into the marble halls, and you begin to hear whispers of another name, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, known only to a few as the Black Pope. He does not wear white. He is not photographed kissing babies. He is rarely seen at all. Yet his influence stretches quietly through the corridors of power, diplomacy, and doctrine. While the White Pope comforts the public, the Black Pope commands the structure. One speaks to the masses, the other speaks to the insiders, and sometimes only one is truly in control. This duality has existed for centuries. It began when the Jesuits rose to prominence in the 16th century. Their mission was to defend the church against enemies, but their methods were not gentle. They were military, strategic, absolute. Their loyalty was not to any nation, but to the papacy itself. And from that foundation, they built an unseen empire, one of schools, missions, and influence. Even today, the Jesuit order runs more educational institutions than any other religious group on earth. Their members are trained in philosophy, science, politics, and languages. They serve as advisors, theologians, and sometimes quiet agents of preservation or control, depending on how you choose to see it. Many believe the Pope is the highest authority in the Catholic world. But what if he is not the author of history, only its narrator? What if the real script is written somewhere deeper, beneath the gold ceilings and stained glass? What if the man in white is the light you are meant to follow, while the man in black is the one who ensures the path never changes? In every performance, the lead actor takes the stage. But the director remains off to the side, watching, guiding, rewriting, if needed. And, in the oldest theatre in Europe, the roles have never changed. So next time you see that white robe wave across the crowd, ask yourself a simple question. Who is standing just beyond the curtain, and why don't they want you to know his name? There is a place so secret most people don't even know it exists. Hidden beneath the streets of Vatican City, buried under centuries of stone and silence, is a vault guarded not by swords, but by rules. It is called the Vatican Secret Archive, and the name alone should make you pause. Because when the most powerful religious institution on earth calls something secret, you have to wonder what they're trying so hard to protect. This archive isn't a legend, it's real. Over 50 kilometers of shelving, more than 1,000 years of documents, letters from kings, notes from popes, ancient manuscripts, maps of places that no longer appear on earth, records of exorcisms, of trials, of things that were never supposed to leave candlelit rooms. But the strangest part isn't just what's inside, it's how tightly it's all been locked away. Not just anyone can walk in, not even most priests. Access is limited to a handful of approved scholars, and even they have to ask permission for one document at a time. No browsing, no photos, no casual reading. You don't even get to see the catalogue of what's there. It's like being told there's a treasure chest under your feet, but you're not allowed to open it or even ask what's inside. And the Vatican has a clever way of explaining it. They say the archive isn't secret, just private. But private from who? From the very people whose history it holds? From the world it claims to serve? That's not privacy, that's control. And it makes you wonder what truths might be hiding in those dark corridors of parchment and dust. Some rumours say the archive holds the original texts that were cut from the Bible. Others claim there are ancient scientific writings banned for being too advanced, stories about Jesus never told, evidence of civilizations erased from maps. There are whispers of letters exchanged with secret societies, records of heresies covered up, even proof that certain historical events never happened the way we were taught, maybe not at all. And every now and then, a fragment escapes, a page, a scroll, a name scratched in the margin of a forgotten manuscript. But when it does, someone always shows up to retrieve it, always in the name of preservation, always too late for questions. So why such tight control? If the archive is just history, why not let people read it? Why not open the shelves and let truth be known? Because maybe it's not just history in those vaults. Maybe it's power. And power, once exposed, can't be taken back. The Vatican says the archive is sacred, that it protects the truth. But maybe the real reason it's sealed is because inside those pages lies something terrifying. Not a lie, but the truth. A truth too dangerous to be known, at least not yet. We are told there was a time when Europe forgot everything. 1,000 years of silence. A period with no inventions, no great thinkers, no real progress. Historians call it the Dark Ages. From the fall of Rome in 476 to the spark of the Renaissance nearly a millennium later. But what if that darkness wasn't real? What if it wasn't a lack of light, but a forced blackout? When you look closer, the story begins to crack. Imagine an entire continent that once gave birth to minds like Aristotle and Cicero, suddenly just stops thinking. No architecture, no philosophy, no science, just war, disease, and superstition for 1,000 years. It doesn't make sense. Civilizations rise and fall, but they don't just hit pause for 1,000 years. not without help. The strangest part isn't just what's missing, it's how quiet the records are. Between the 5th and 10th centuries, the trail of history becomes a whisper. Chronicles vanish, letters dry up, cities like Milan, Cologne and Lyon stop producing anything new. No books, no art, no ideas. It's like someone pulled the plug on Europe's brain and left the rest of the world to move forward without it. Because while Europe was supposedly sleeping, the rest of the world wasn't. In China, the Tang dynasty created poetry, science, and block printing. In the Islamic world, scholars built hospitals, explored astronomy, and laid the foundation of algebra. Ancient texts were being translated, preserved, and expanded. So how is it that only one part of the world just went dark? Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was covered, edited, forgotten on purpose. Because when you erase records, you don't just delete events, you delete memory, and memory is power. If people forget who they were, they'll never question who they've become. There are stories of advanced tools discovered in European soil, dated squarely within the so-called Dark Ages, intricate gears, medical instruments, aqueduct systems, even manuscripts with knowledge far beyond what should have been known. But these are called anomalies, or brushed aside as coincidence, because they don't fit the story. And who controls the story? During those quiet centuries, the only ones writing anything down were monks, locked away in monasteries, copying what they were told to copy, preserving only what the church approved. And when they looked back on the past, they decided what stayed and what was left to fade. So maybe the Dark Ages weren't dark because nothing happened. Maybe they're dark because we've been kept from seeing what did. A fog rolled over Europe, not from ignorance, but from silence. A silence maintained not by nature, but by design. The question isn't whether history was lost. The question is, who wanted it gone, and what was buried in those missing years that might change everything we think we know about where we came from. Imagine a world where knowledge was fire, and someone made it their mission to put out every flame. That world was Europe after the fall of Rome, and the ones holding the water were not invaders or kings. They were the keepers of faith, the ones who claimed to protect souls, but instead they burned the books that kept those souls awake. Across the continent, libraries that once held the wisdom of Greece, Rome, Egypt and beyond went silent. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were destroyed. Scrolls that mapped the stars. Writings on medicine, mechanics and philosophy, gone. All in the name of spiritual purity. If it did not serve doctrine, it did not survive. And it wasn't random. This was a campaign. A quiet war, not fought with swords, but with fire and ink. When the church began its rise to power, it understood something vital. Whoever controls the past controls the present. And books were the past. They held ideas that questioned heaven, explored nature, and dared to think for themselves. That kind of freedom was dangerous. So they called it heresy. They branded entire schools of thought as pagan, dangerous, evil. Then they erased them. Texts were seized from temples, academies, and even private homes. Some were locked away. Others were set ablaze in public squares. The smoke wasn't just from paper, it was from memory. In Alexandria, centuries before this campaign even began, the Great Library was already a warning, one of the greatest collections of knowledge ever assembled, burned, piece by piece. Not all at once, but slowly over time. Each fire lighting the way for future flames to follow. And when the church rose to power, that path was already clear. Whole libraries vanished. In Rome, in Constantinople, in the corners of Europe where ancient scholars had once worked in peace, their writings were taken by monks, under orders from religious leaders. What was useful to the church was copied. What was not was erased. Sometimes forever. The irony is, this was done for salvation. They said it was to protect the faithful, to keep people from dangerous ideas. But in doing so, they didn't protect people. They blinded them. They took away the very tools that let humans understand themselves and their world. A book is more than just pages. It's a voice, a mind reaching across time. And when you burn it, you don't just destroy paper. You destroy the person who wrote it. You destroy everyone who might have read it, understood it, been changed by it. They called it purification. But what they really did was rewrite the future by silencing the past. And once that silence took hold, people no longer even remembered what had been lost. The fire didn't just consume books, it consumed the truth. And when the flames died down, only one story remained, the one approved by those who lit the match. What if the year you were born never actually happened? What if the date on your calendar was part of a story someone else wrote 1,000 years ago? Time feels solid, unchanging, but it isn't. Because the way we count time has been changed before, and the one holding the pen was the church. In ancient Rome, they used the Julian calendar. It was simple but slightly off. Every year added a little extra time until eventually the seasons and the dates started to drift apart. By the 1500s, the church had a problem. Easter, the most sacred day of the year, was slowly slipping away from the spring equinox. And if the church couldn't even keep its holy days in order, how could it claim to control time? So Pope Gregory XIII stepped in. In 1582, he introduced a new calendar, the Gregorian calendar, the one we still use today. To fix the problem, he simply erased days. October 4th was followed by October 15th, 10 days gone, just like that. And the world didn't end. People just kept going, like nothing had happened. But that's not the strange part. The strange part is how easy it was to do. Time, the very thing we all live by, can be edited, adjusted, rewritten. And if 10 days can vanish without a trace, what else could be changed? Some researchers believe much more than days were lost. They believe centuries were added. This is the heart of a theory called the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that around 300 years in the early Middle Ages were never real, that someone inflated the calendar to create a longer history, and the main suspect is once again the Vatican. Why would they do this? Because time is power. If you control the calendar, you decide when kings ruled, when prophecies are fulfilled, and how ancient your authority appears. By adding years, you can make your dynasty look older, more divine, more unbroken. And when history lines up with religious timelines, you can claim it was destiny, not design. The more you look, the more odd things appear. Astronomical events, like eclipses, don't always match the historical dates recorded in old texts. Some figures, from different eras, seem like copies of each other. Charlemagne and Constantine, for example. Same victories, same reforms, different names. And in the middle of all this, confusion is the church quietly guiding the rhythm of time. They say the Gregorian calendar was about accuracy, science, truth, but it was also about control. Because when people believe in the time you give them, they believe in the story you attach to it. And once that belief is strong enough, you don't need to prove anything. You only need to let the clock keep ticking. So the next time you check the date, ask yourself this: who decided what year it is? And what if the truth is buried not in the past, but in the space between the seconds? There is a strange gap in history, a thick fog that covers almost 300 years between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. People call it the early Middle Ages. But what if it never happened? What if those centuries were not lost, but invented? This is the heart of the phantom time hypothesis, a theory that suggests parts of our history were fabricated. Entire kings, battles, even years themselves. It sounds impossible at first, but when you look closer, things start to feel off. There is a period from about 614 to 911 AD where almost nothing seems to happen. The records are thin, the buildings are few. The events repeat themselves with strange similarities. Some historians have called it a historical twilight, but others believe it is more like a forged document, something designed to make the present seem older, more legitimate, more holy. The theory was first introduced by a German historian named Heribert Illig. He noticed that certain rulers from this missing period appeared suspiciously legendary, like Charlemagne, a warrior king who supposedly united Europe-built schools, spread Christianity, and conquered massive territories. But the evidence is weirdly thin. No grave, no original documents. Just stories that read more like myth than memory. Then there are the astronomical records. Ancient cultures tracked the stars precisely. Eclipses, comets, alignments. When modern scientists checked these events against the official timeline, things didn't line up. Eclipses that should have happened didn't. Others appeared centuries too early or too late. It was like the stars were arguing with history, and the stars don't lie. So who would add fake centuries? And why? One answer points straight to the church. Imagine you are a pope in the 10th century trying to claim divine rule over Europe. The Bible contains timelines leading back to Christ and beyond. But your current year doesn't line up. It's too early, so you shift the calendar, add a few centuries. Suddenly your reign falls perfectly into the prophecy. The dates match the scripture, and no one is the wiser. It sounds like science fiction. But the truth is, the medieval world didn't keep records like we do today. Most people couldn't read or write. The only ones copying history were monks. And if they were told to copy a version of events that added years or kings or victories, they did, not out of malice, out of obedience. Once those new dates were written into the church calendar, everything else had to match. Documents were backdated, holidays were adjusted, saints were invented to fill the gaps, and the fog thickened. If this theory is true, it changes everything. It means parts of our history are not just missing. They were never real. It means we are living in a timeline that was edited like a script. And the scariest part is not how they did it. It's how easily we believed it. The stars do not lie. They move in patterns so precise we can predict eclipses centuries in advance. Long before telescopes, ancient civilizations were already tracking the sky. They carved positions into stone-built observatories and followed the stars like a cosmic clock. And for the most part, the stars always matched what they recorded, until they didn't. When modern scientists began checking old astronomical records against our current timeline, they found something strange. Eclipses recorded in ancient manuscripts didn't match where or when they should have happened. Some eclipses were missing, others appeared too early or in the wrong part of the world. It was like someone had changed the calendar and hoped the sky wouldn't notice. One of the biggest problems appears in the early Middle Ages, the same period that the phantom time hypothesis says might have been invented. There are hardly any clear records of astronomical events from that era. But more importantly, the few that exist do not match what the sky would have looked like if those years really happened. The Earth moves with the planets, the Sun, and the Moon. And that movement is like a giant cosmic fingerprint. You can't fake it unless you fake the time. Some scholars believe the Church had good reason to shift the calendar. In the 10th century, Pope Sylvester II was said to be obsessed with prophecy. The year 1000 was believed to mark the end of the world or the return of Christ. But if the calendar wasn't quite there yet, what could you do? You adjust it. You add just enough time to bring everything in line with the sacred story. Suddenly, you're not just watching history, you're shaping it. The strange part is how few people could even notice. Back then, hardly anyone had access to star charts or records. Only a small group of scholars, monks, and astronomers tracked the heavens. If someone changed the dates on a manuscript, who would question it? Who would dare accuse the Church of rewriting the sky? But the sky kept its own record. Today, computers can recreate what the heavens looks like on any given day in history. And when researchers test ancient eclipse data against modern models, the gaps are clear. It's not just one or two mistakes, it's a pattern. A pattern that suggests our calendar might be off by centuries. This isn't just about stars, it's about truth. If the dates are wrong, then the events tied to those dates might be wrong too. Births, deaths, reigns of kings, even the foundations of entire nations, all of it based on a clock that was quietly tampered with. The stars betrayed the Church not out of revenge, but out of honesty. They revealed the cracks in the timeline. And once you see those cracks, you can't unsee them. You start to wonder what else has been edited, what else has been rearranged, and just how far back the lie really goes. There was a time when there were more than just 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the only voices telling the story of Jesus. There were others, dozens of them, written by disciples, by followers, by people who claimed to have known the truth firsthand. These were the lost Gospels, and the Church made sure you would never hear them. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas paint a very different picture of early Christianity. In some of them, Jesus does not speak of churches or rules. He speaks of inner knowledge, of unlocking truth from within. He tells his followers that the kingdom of God is not somewhere far away, but already inside them. That message was powerful, too powerful. The Church had a problem. If everyone had access to divine truth from within themselves, they might stop listening to the priests. They might stop needing the middlemen. And so these texts were labelled dangerous, heretical, forbidden, not because they were false, but because they threatened control. Over the centuries, these writings were buried, literally, hidden in jars in deserts, locked away in monasteries, burned when discovered. For nearly 2,000 years, most of the world didn't even know they existed. Then in 1945, everything changed. In a cave near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a farmer uncovered a collection of ancient scrolls. Inside were books that had not been read in over 1,500 years. Some of them had names that echoed through history. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and the most mysterious of all, the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was not like the others. It had no stories, no miracles, no crucifixion, just sayings. One after another, attributed to Jesus, but written in a voice that felt older, deeper, more symbolic. Some scholars believe it may be closer to the original teachings than anything found in the Bible today. Then came the Gospel of Mary, a text where Mary Magdalene is not just a follower, but a leader. someone Jesus trusted with secret teachings. The male disciples argue with her, question her, but she speaks with calm authority. It was a version of history where women were not just present, they were powerful. That too was a threat. So what happened to these books? The Church declared them false, dangerous, apocryphal, a word that means hidden, but hidden by who, and for what reason? What if these texts were not rejected because they were untrue, but because they offered a truth that could not be controlled? A truth that made faith personal instead of institutional. That made enlightenment something you could find without a priest, or a building, or a throne. These Gospels were not lost by accident. They were lost on purpose. And now that they've been found, we have a choice. To ignore them like we were taught, or to read the words the Church never wanted us to see, and wonder why they were hidden for so long. There was once a list so feared that even reading the books on it could damn your soul. It wasn't written by a dictator or a king. It was written by the Church, and it lasted for centuries. They called it the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, a name that sounds official and orderly. But behind that title was one of the longest-running censorship campaigns in human history. The index began in the 1500s, but its roots go back even further. As printing presses spread across Europe and books became easier to copy and share, the Church realized something. Ideas were slipping through their fingers. People were reading things they were not supposed to read, questioning teachings they were supposed to accept, and worst of all, they were thinking for themselves. So the Vatican responded with silence, not by arguing or debating, but by banning. They began compiling a list of authors and titles that no Catholic was allowed to read, not in private, not in study, not even for curiosity. Owning these books was a sin. Printing them was worse. Some were burned, others were hidden, and the list grew longer with each generation. It included names that might surprise you: Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes, Voltaire, even novels, even poetry. Anything that hinted at freedom of thought was dangerous. Anything that challenged church authority was evil. The index wasn't just a list, it was a cage built from paper and fear. And it worked. For centuries, people were too afraid to question what they read in church. Scholars wrote with caution. Printers hesitated. Whole areas of science and philosophy were frozen in time, while the world waited for permission to move forward. Some of the banned books were about astronomy. Others explored medicine or the human body. Some asked uncomfortable questions about the Bible. Others told stories where heroes did not always follow religious rules. But they all had one thing in common. They encouraged people to think outside the official story. By the 1800s, the list had over 4,000 titles. But it wasn't just about what was banned. It was about who got to decide. The Church held the power to silence any voice simply by adding a name to the index. No trial, no defense. Just a quiet disappearance into a growing archive of forbidden thought. Even when the index was officially abolished in 1966, its spirit lived on. Censorship didn't vanish, it just changed shape. Today, we call it misinformation, disinformation, inappropriate content. But the goal remains the same: control the story, silence the questions. The Index of Forbidden Books is more than a relic. It is a reminder that knowledge is power, and power fears being questioned. So when someone tells you not to read something, maybe that's exactly what you should be reading. Because the truth doesn't need to be hidden, only lies do. In the quiet of his study, Galileo Galilei looked through a telescope and saw something that would shake the world. Moons orbiting Jupiter, craters on the moon, phases of Venus. The heavens were not perfect and unchanging like the Church had always claimed. The Earth was not the centre of everything. It moved, it spun, it orbited the sun. And that truth was terrifying to the people in power. Galileo did not invent the idea of a sun-centered universe. That idea came from Copernicus. But Galileo was the one who proved it, with lenses and math and reason. And when he tried to share that truth, he found himself facing a power more dangerous than gravity, the Vatican. At first, the Church tolerated Galileo. Some priests were even curious. But the deeper he looked into the stars, the more trouble he found on Earth. Because his discoveries didn't just challenge science, they challenged Scripture. The Bible said the world was fixed, that the sun rose and set, that heaven was above and hell was below. If Galileo was right, then maybe those verses were wrong. And if one verse could be wrong, what else could be? In 1616, the Church warned him. They told him to stop teaching that the earth moved. He agreed. But years later, he published a book. It was called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. It was clever, written like a conversation between three characters. But one of those characters who defended the old earth-centered model sounded suspiciously foolish, like someone too proud to admit the truth. And people noticed, especially one man, Pope Urban VIII. The Pope felt mocked, betrayed. Galileo had once been in his good graces. Now he was calling him out in public. So in 1633, the Church put Galileo on trial, not for lying, but for telling the truth too loudly. The Inquisition accused him of heresy, a crime not against people, but against belief. Galileo was 70 years old, sick, half blind. He stood before men in robes who never looked through a telescope and was forced to deny what he had seen with his own eyes. They made him recant, forced him to say the earth stood still. Legend says as he left the courtroom he muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. They sentenced him to house arrest for the rest of his life. They banned his books, they silenced his voice, all to protect a story that could no longer hold up to the sky. It took the Church centuries to admit it was wrong. In 1992, Pope John Paul II officially acknowledged the mistake. But the damage had already been done, not just to Galileo, but to science, to truth, to the idea that facts could stand above faith. Galileo's story is not just about astronomy, it's about what happens when power fears the light, when truth is put on trial, and when chains are used not to hold prisoners, but to hold back progress. There was a time when asking the wrong question could get you killed. Not because you broke a law or hurt someone, but because you thought too much. In that world, curiosity was a crime, and the punishment was silence. That world was ruled by the Inquisition. The word sounds ancient, like something from a dusty textbook, but the Inquisition was very real and very deadly. It began in the 12th century and lasted for hundreds of years. Its mission was simple: find the heretics, erase them, not just from the Church, but from history. A heretic wasn't always someone who did something wrong. Sometimes they just said something different. A priest who believed God could speak through nature. A woman who practiced healing with herbs. A scholar who suggested the earth was older than the Bible claimed. Anyone who challenged the official story could become a target. The Inquisition operated in secret. No public trials, no defense attorneys, no mercy. People were arrested in the middle of the night, accused based on rumors or anonymous letters. They were taken to dark rooms where they were told to confess. If they refused, they were tortured. If they broke and told the truth, they were punished. If they lied, they were punished. Either way, the silence won. Some were burned alive in front of crowds. Others were locked away for life. Their writings were destroyed, their names erased from records, and the church claimed it was all for the good of the soul. Better to suffer now than to burn forever later. But it wasn't just about saving souls, it was about protecting power, because every question was a crack in the wall of control, and the Inquisition was the cement used to patch it up. The church didn't just want obedience, it wanted agreement, total unquestioning belief. Over time, the Inquisition spread to Spain, to Portugal, even to the Americas, and with every step it grew more brutal. Entire cultures were wiped out in the name of purity. Books were burned in piles that lit up the night. Scientists, mystics, thinkers, artists, anyone who stepped outside the narrow path was marked as dangerous. And yet, people still questioned, still whispered, still wondered why. Because ideas are hard to kill. You can burn a book, but not the thought behind it. You can silence a voice, but not the curiosity it sparked in others. The Inquisition officially ended in the 1800s, but its shadow remains in every system that punishes thought, in every authority that fears questions. It reminds us that truth does not always survive on its own. It has to be protected, even fought for, because once there was a world where questions were met with chains, where thinking too much meant vanishing without a trace. And if we forget that world, we risk building it again, one quiet fear at a time. In dusty libraries and forgotten corners of old collections, there are maps that should not exist. Drawn centuries before satellites and sonar, they show coastlines covered in ice today. They outline continents that had not been officially discovered. And they raise a question no one seems able to answer. How did they know? One of the most famous is the Piri Reis map. Created in 1513 by a Turkish admiral, it is made from pieces of older charts. But what's strange isn't just what it shows, it's what it shows accurately. South America is drawn with shocking precision. The west coast of Africa lines up almost perfectly, but the most mind-blowing part is at the bottom, Antarctica. Not just a hint of it, a full coastline, detailed, ice-free. But Antarctica wasn't even officially discovered until 1820, and by then it was already buried under miles of ice. So how did a map from 1513 show it the way it would have looked thousands of years ago? Some say it's a coincidence, others claim it's just a guess. But the map's measurements are too exact to ignore, and it's not alone. There are others. The Oronsfine map from 1531, the Mercator maps, even some medieval European charts show land masses in places explorers weren't supposed to have reached yet. Lands across the Atlantic, coastlines of South America, shapes of islands no sailor had yet seen. So where did these maps come from? One answer is that they were copied, not invented, passed down from sources long lost, from civilizations that explored more than we give them credit for, civilizations that may have known the Earth better than we do now. That idea terrifies people in power, because it means history might not start where we think it does. And here's where the Vatican enters the story, because many of these strange maps came from monks and scholars connected to the church, copied in monasteries, preserved in secret archives. And when they were brought to light, the Church offered no explanation, just silence. If these charts came from ancient explorers we were never taught about, then someone chose not to teach us. Someone edited that part out of the story, maybe because it conflicted with the idea of Europe discovering the world. Maybe because it showed that knowledge once lived outside the Church's reach. The truth is that old maps tell a different version of history, one where people sailed farther earlier and with more skill than we were told, one where ancient knowledge was real and widespread, and maybe even global. But that version is buried, labelled myth, dismissed. Still, the maps remain. Ink on skin, parchment or paper, silent witnesses to a forgotten world. And when you look at them, you feel it, that something big is missing from our history. A chapter ripped out, a journey untold, and the question that refuses to go away. Who drew the first map of the world, and why have we been kept from seeing the whole thing? For most of history, going to school wasn't about learning how to think. It was about learning how to obey. And the people who designed that system didn't just want students, they wanted believers. The Church knew something early on that others would only learn later. If you control education, you control the future. After the fall of Rome, much of Europe's learning was taken over by monasteries. The monks became the teachers, the Bible became the textbook, and the lesson was simple. Truth comes from above, from authority, from the Church. Your job wasn't to ask questions, it was to memorize answers. This wasn't an accident, it was a design. A structure built to train generations of minds, not to explore, but to accept. Theology replaced science, scripture replaced observation, and the world shrank into a narrow path where only approved thoughts could survive. When universities were born, many of them were church institutions. Places like Oxford and Paris were tied directly to bishops and popes. And even though they taught things like math and medicine, those subjects were always framed within a religious cage. You could study the stars, but only if you agreed they moved in perfect circles because God made them that way. You could study the human body, but not if it led you to challenge the soul. Students were taught to recite, not to question, to argue only within the lines, to obey not out of fear, but out of faith. And the more educated you became, the more loyal you were expected to be. Independent thought was not rewarded. It was dangerous. Heresy wore many faces, and one of them was curiosity. Even the language of learning was controlled, Latin. A language only the educated elite understood. That meant if you couldn't read Latin, you couldn't read the Bible, you couldn't read the laws. You couldn't challenge what you were told. And who taught Latin? The Church. The result was a population that believed education made you wise while never realizing what was being hidden. People trusted their teachers but didn't know who trained them. Trusted their books but didn't know who edited them. Trusted their faith but never asked who shaped it. And when someone did break free, when a thinker dared to question the system, they were labelled a threat, burned, banned, forgotten. Their ideas locked away in dusty corners of forgotten libraries or buried under layers of religious fear. The education system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. It didn't fail to teach critical thinking. It taught obedience instead. And obedience became a virtue. Even now, echoes of that system remain. Schools that teach facts without questioning where those facts come from. Tests that reward memorization over understanding. Institutions that discourage dissent in the name of tradition, because the easiest way to control people isn't through violence, it's through education. Teach them what to think, and they will never learn how to think. Teach them what to believe, and they will never ask why. And in the end, they will defend the very system that keeps them blind. There was a time when words were walls, not just sounds or letters, but barriers that separated the powerful from the powerless. At the heart of those walls was Latin. Not the Latin of ancient Rome that poets and emperors once spoke, but a newer version, Church Latin, ecclesiastical Latin, a language that sounded holy but served a very different purpose: control. After the Roman Empire faded, Latin didn't disappear, it evolved, and the Vatican claimed it for itself. While common people spoke their own local languages, the Church kept Latin as the language of heaven. Bibles were written in Latin. Sermons were spoken in Latin. Laws were recorded in Latin. If you didn't understand it, you were lost. But that was the point. Imagine sitting in a church hearing a priest speak words you couldn't understand, being told your salvation, your sin, your soul depended on those words. But they were locked behind a language you were never taught. That was daily life for millions of people across Europe. They prayed in Latin, sang in Latin, died with Latin, words whispered in their ears, but those words were never theirs. The Church said Latin was pure, sacred, unchanging, but in truth it was a gatekeeper. It made sure only the educated, the approved, the loyal, had access to the deeper meaning. Everyone else had to trust, had to obey. Because asking questions without understanding the language was like trying to solve a puzzle without the pieces. This language divide wasn't just spiritual, it was political, legal, economic. Contracts were written in Latin, land grants, decrees, wills. If you couldn't read Latin, you could be tricked out of your property, your rights, even your freedom. And who controlled the Latin? The clergy. When brave people tried to change this, they were punished. One of the most famous was William Tyndale. He dared to translate the Bible into English, so that everyday people could read it for themselves. So they wouldn't need a priest to tell them what it meant. For that crime, he was hunted, tortured, and burned at the stake. His final prayer was simple: Lord, open the King of England's eyes. The Church feared the translation of sacred texts, not because the words would change, but because the power would shift. Once people could read for themselves, they could ask better questions, find different meanings, discover contradictions. And when that happened, control would start to slip. Eventually, Latin began to fade from the pulpits and courts. But the damage had been done. For centuries, knowledge had been trapped behind a language curtain, and only those allowed behind it could see the truth. Today, we think of Latin as something ancient, something harmless. But it was once the sharpest tool in the Church's arsenal, a weapon made of grammar and silence. And it reminds us that language isn't just about communication. It's about who gets to speak, who gets to understand, and who gets to decide what truth sounds like. Not all censorship looks like fire. Sometimes it looks like a locked door, a missing page, a quiet delay. The truth is that the Church did not always destroy knowledge. Sometimes it preserved it. But not to share, not to teach, just to wait. And when knowledge is delayed, it is the same as if it were denied. Inside the walls of the Vatican are texts that have not been read by the public in centuries. Ancient writings, scientific theories, lost histories. They are not banned exactly, they are just unavailable, waiting for the right time, or the right audience, or maybe just waiting to be forgotten. This isn't a secret. The Vatican has one of the largest and oldest libraries on earth. Millions of documents, some dating back over 1,000 years. But if you want to read them, you can't just walk in. You need permission, special status, approval from people who decide if you're worthy. And even then, entire sections are off limits. So what are they keeping? We may never know the full list, but there are clues. Letters from early scientists that vanished after being sent to church leaders. Documents about lost civilizations that do not match the official history. Ancient astronomical charts that suggest the stars told a different story than what we were taught. Even medical texts describing cures and treatments centuries ahead of their time. It's not that the church didn't know. It's that they chose when the world would know, and that choice shaped everything. When Galileo proved the earth moved, the church waited. When books about anatomy and disease surfaced, they were hidden. When maps showed places no one was supposed to have discovered, yet they were buried. Think about how much time was lost. How many discoveries could have come earlier? How many lives could have been saved? How many ideas could have grown? All because someone decided it was not time yet. And when the church did release knowledge, it often came with a twist. A rewriting, a stamp of approval that shaped how it would be understood. Truth filtered through power becomes something else. A controlled truth, a tamed truth, the kind that no longer threatens the people who delayed it. In modern times, we see the same pattern. Information held back, not destroyed but withheld, until it's convenient, until it serves a purpose, until the public is ready. But who decides when we're ready? And what gets lost while we wait? Knowledge is not neutral. When you delay it, you change its impact. A discovery in the wrong hands at the right time can shift the world. A cure that comes too late might as well have never existed. A truth that arrives centuries after the lie has taken root will always struggle to be heard. So when they say the church preserved knowledge, they're not lying, but they're not telling the whole truth either. Because knowledge locked in a vault is no different than knowledge turned to ash. Both are kept from the people who need it most. And sometimes silence is the loudest kind of control. They were not kings or warriors. They did not command armies or rule empires, but they shaped history more quietly than any conqueror ever could. They were monks, dressed in simple robes, living in stone-walled silence. But behind those cloistered walls, they became the architects of what we remember and what we forget. The Benedictines were some of the first. Founded in a world crumbling after the fall of Rome, they built monasteries across Europe, like islands of order in a sea of chaos. They copied books by hand, page after page, ink and patience replacing the fire of war, and in those books they chose what was saved and what was not. Pagan texts, ancient science, histories that didn't align with their worldview. Some were kept, others quietly left to rot. They weren't just copying the past, they were curating it. The Franciscans came later with a vow of poverty and humility, but don't let the bare feet fool you. They were deeply tied to church power, trusted as missionaries, educators, agents of spiritual influence. They travelled far and wide, bringing the official story with them. They translated it, taught it, defended it, and made sure no other version got through. But the most mysterious of all were the Jesuits. Founded in the 1500s, they weren't just monks. They were soldiers, thinkers, spies. They pledged absolute loyalty to the Pope and became the intellectual sword of the Vatican. Jesuits founded schools that shaped the minds of kings. They studied languages, cultures, astronomy, but always through a lens designed to protect the faith, not challenge it. They were masters of narrative, and they knew something others didn't, that controlling what people know is even more powerful than controlling what they do. The Jesuits built knowledge like a fortress. Every idea tested, every fact fitted into a larger plan, and anything that didn't match was quietly removed. You've probably never heard of many of the documents they erased, the stories they changed, the versions of events that no longer exist. That's the point. Silence doesn't announce itself. It spreads slowly, calmly, until you forget there was ever anything to hear. These monastic orders were not villains in black robes. They believed they were doing good, saving souls, preserving truth. But the road to control is often paved with noble intentions. And somewhere along the line, protection turned into manipulation. When you read a history book, you're reading what survived, what was copied, what was allowed. And the hands that made those decisions often wore the robes of monks. The silence wasn't just a practice, it was a strategy. Even today, the influence remains. In church-run schools, in libraries, in records held behind locked doors. The narrative is still curated, still shaped, still guarded. So when we ask who wrote history, we can't just look at the authors. We have to look at the copyists, the translators, the keepers of silence. Because sometimes the loudest truths are the ones we were never taught to hear. They called themselves the Society of Jesus, but most people know them by another name, the Jesuits. At first glance, they looked like monks, priests, teachers. But behind the black robes and quiet smiles was something more, something deeper. The Jesuits were not just men of faith. They were strategists, scholars, enforcers, and depending on who you ask, they may have been the most powerful secret weapon the Vatican ever created. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits were born in a time of chaos. The Protestant Reformation was tearing Europe apart. The Church was losing its grip, and so it needed a new kind of soldier. One who could fight not with swords but with words, not with armies but with ideas. Jesuits took a vow of obedience unlike any other. Absolute loyalty to the Pope. No questioning, no hesitation. They trained for years, studying languages, science, philosophy, politics. They became experts in everything. But they didn't just learn. They watched, listened, took notes. In many ways, they were the original intelligence network, sent to foreign courts as advisors, to universities as professors, to mission fields as explorers. But wherever they went, they reported back quietly. Precisely, they tracked who was loyal, who was drifting, who was dangerous. And when needed, they intervened. Some say they stopped revolts before they began, shifted alliances between kings, guided wars from the shadows, always with one goal, to protect the Church, not just from enemies outside, but from questions within. Their schools became world famous, and for good reason. Jesuit education was the best, rigorous, elite. Students learned logic, rhetoric, theology, but always with a framework, a filter, a lens that made sure the truth led back to Rome. And if it didn't, the Jesuits were there to steer it back. They weren't just teachers, they were architects of thought. They shaped how the next generation of leaders would think, feel, and act. They weren't burning books like the Inquisition. They were outthinking them, outsmarting them, outlasting them. That's why some feared them. Some even banned them. By the 1700s, multiple countries expelled the Jesuits. Portugal, France, Spain. They said the Jesuits were manipulating politics, controlling economies, acting like a shadow government. Too powerful, too secretive, too loyal to a pope instead of a king. For a while, the Jesuit order was shut down. Officially, but unofficially, their influence never really disappeared, because they had already trained the minds who would continue their mission, built the networks, written the scripts. Today, they still exist, running schools, writing books, advising leaders, still calm, still quiet, still watching. The Jesuit equation is simple. Take brilliant minds, add total obedience, multiply by global reach, and subtract anything that threatens the church. What you get is not just a religious order. You get an invisible force, one that doesn't need to be seen to shape the world. And in the shadows of history, their fingerprints are everywhere, in science, in politics, in philosophy, and in the silence that follows every hard question that no one wants to answer. While the church worked to erase certain truths from the pages of history, another group was quietly carving them into stone. Not in libraries, not in vaults, but in symbols, rituals, and hidden messages that could only be read by those who knew how to look. They were called Freemasons. And they didn't just build cathedrals, they built a counter-memory. No one knows exactly when the Freemasons began. Some say they started as medieval stoneworkers, passing secret techniques from master to apprentice. Others believe they go back even further to ancient Egypt or the Temple of Solomon. But by the time they appeared in full view in Europe, they were no longer just builders. They were guardians. Of what? That depends on who you ask. To the church, the Freemasons were a threat. They didn't follow one dogma. They didn't answer to the Pope. They allowed people of different faiths to gather as equals. Worse, they encouraged critical thinking, debate, study of the stars, the human body, ancient texts the church had tried to bury. In a world built on obedience, the Masons promoted inquiry, and so they became enemies. But the Masons didn't fight back with weapons, they fought with memory. They encoded stories into architecture, embedded mathematics into blueprints, wove myths into initiation rites. From the outside, a Masonic lodge looked like any other building, but inside it was a living library, a place where forbidden knowledge could be remembered without ever being written down. Some believe the layout of Gothic cathedrals holds clues, that the numbers in their design match ancient cosmic patterns, that the placement of columns and arches mirrors celestial events, that the builders were passing on truths about the universe disguised as art. And if you knew the code, you could read it. Masonic symbols appeared in unexpected places, on tombstones, in city plans, on currency, the square and compass, the all-seeing eye, the blazing star. To outsiders, they were decoration. To insiders, they were messages, reminders of hidden truths kept alive under centuries of silence. Not all Freemasons were rebels. Many were just thinkers, builders, philosophers, but their refusal to obey blindly made them dangerous. Popes issued warnings, kings ordered crackdowns. Still the lodges spread, quietly, globally. And through it all, the Masons kept remembering, not just facts or dates, but ideas. Ancient ideas about balance, freedom, light and darkness. The power of symbols to speak when speech was forbidden. Today, most people think of the Freemasons as a mystery, a curiosity, something old men join for tradition. But the truth runs deeper. Because while the church erased stories from books, the Masons etched them into the bones of cities. They didn't shout, they whispered. They didn't write history. They preserved the parts that were almost lost, in secret, in silence, in stone. And maybe that's why the Vatican feared them. Not because they wanted to destroy the church, but because they remembered what the church wanted the world to forget. There was a time when the line between magic and science had not yet been drawn, when strange lights in the sky or sudden cures were not seen as puzzles to solve, but signs from above. But what if some of those miracles were never miracles at all? What if they were just science that arrived too early? And what if the church knew that all along? In the age of miracles, the Vatican stood as the gatekeeper between heaven and earth. People looked to it for answers when crops failed, when the stars shifted, when someone sick was suddenly healed. If it could not be explained, then it was divine. A gift from God, a message, a punishment, and only the church could interpret it. But behind that divine curtain were real questions, unanswered questions. What if the sudden healing was caused by a plant someone accidentally chewed? What if the moving lights in the sky were a comet or a man-made craft? What if the person who predicted an eclipse wasn't a prophet, but a mathematician? The church couldn't risk people thinking that way, because curiosity leads to discovery. Discovery leads to independence, and independence weakens control. So the solution was simple: rebrand it. Take the unexplained and stamp it with holy approval. If someone built a machine that worked too well, it was called witchcraft unless the church blessed it. If someone healed too many people with herbs or oils, they were called heretics unless they gave the credit to saints. If a strange event happened in the sky, it was a miracle only if the clergy said so. This wasn't just about belief, it was about erasing human achievement. People who may have stumbled onto medicine or early technology or cosmic understanding were often written out of the story. Their discoveries turned into legends, their tools labelled relics, their knowledge buried. Because if people realised that they themselves could understand the world, if they saw that power didn't come just from above, but from within, then they might stop listening to the ones in robes. You can still see the pattern in the way history remembers. Look at ancient inventors, thinkers, builders. So many of them are forgotten or turned into myths. Others were canonized, made into saints, so their genius could be folded back into religion. That way, their stories stayed safe, but their ideas stayed locked. It's not that miracles never happened, it's that not all of them were miracles. Some were science before its time, some were human brilliance misnamed on purpose. And the more you look, the more you start to wonder how much of our progress was delayed because it was labelled divine. The Vatican didn't need to burn every book or silence every thinker. Sometimes all it had to do was change the name. A machine became a holy object. A formula became a prophecy. A discovery became a sign. And just like that, science was hidden in plain sight, dressed as faith. And the people who made it possible faded into the background while the miracle took centre stage. In the middle of what we're taught were the darkest centuries of Europe. Something strange starts to appear. Hints of machines, glimpses of forgotten tech, tools and devices that shouldn't have existed, not yet. Not there, not then. The Dark Ages were supposed to be a time of ignorance and collapse. But buried under layers of mud and silence is a different story. One filled with metal gears, glowing stones and inventions that vanished just as quickly as they appeared. There are old church bells from the 8th century that seem too perfectly tuned to be made with the tools historians say existed at the time. Massive doors carved with precision that would take modern machines to replicate. Maps showing rivers and coastlines with eerie accuracy. How? In dusty corners of old monasteries, we find sketches of strange devices. Wheels that turn by themselves. tubes that focus light, diagrams of what looks like early batteries or engines. At first glance, you might think they're just symbols or spiritual metaphors. But look closer. Some of them show knowledge of gravity, pressure, even magnetism, long before those ideas became mainstream science. And then there are the books. Texts translated from even older sources, talking about flying machines and healing metals and artificial limbs that moved with thought. Not myths, not legends, descriptions, schematics, recorded with the calm voice of someone documenting reality. So what happened to all of it? Some say these machines were one-of-a-kind miracles, built by gifted minds and then lost to time. Others believe they were stolen, locked away, hidden before they could spread. Because new technology challenges the old order, a machine that heals without prayer threatens the power of the priest. A tool that predicts the stars better than scripture is dangerous. The Vatican had a reputation for collecting strange things, manuscripts, artifacts, devices. They said it was for preservation, but preservation in a vault no one can enter is another word for disappearance. Even today, archaeologists dig up gears fused in rock, lenses more advanced than what was used centuries later. And every time the same explanation is whispered, it must have been a fluke, a mistake, a miracle. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had figured it out? And instead of spreading that knowledge, they were silenced. Their workshop burned, their notes confiscated, their memory wiped clean. It's easy to think of history as a straight line, from dark to light, from ignorance to enlightenment. But maybe it's not a line at all. Maybe it's a cycle, a spiral, where the same breakthroughs are made and buried over and over. And maybe the darkest part of the Dark Ages wasn't the lack of knowledge. Maybe it was the fear of it. The fear that if too many people understood too much too soon, the world would change too fast. So instead of a revolution, we got silence. Instead of machines, we got miracles. And behind every miracle was a mind that never made it into the history books. It didn't always take chains to silence someone. Sometimes all it took was a look from the wrong priest or a whisper in the right ear. For centuries, the real war wasn't fought with swords or armies. It was fought in minds, in quiet rooms, in libraries lit by candlelight. It was a war against curiosity. Ask the wrong question and you risked your future. Discover something too advanced and you risked your life. In a time when the church controlled what truth looked like, anything that didn't fit was treated as a threat. Not because it was evil, but because it was new. Thinkers were watched, inventors were followed. Scholars were tested not just for what they knew, but for how they believed. If your ideas moved too far outside the accepted story, you were warned. If you kept going, you were erased. Take the story of Michael Servetus. He discovered that blood moves through the lungs in a way no one had ever described before. It was groundbreaking, but he also questioned the Trinity. That was enough. He was arrested, condemned, and burned with his own books as kindling. His curiosity became a crime. Or look at Hypatia in Alexandria, one of the earliest known female mathematicians, a brilliant mind in a male-dominated world. She studied astronomy, taught philosophy, and challenged religious leaders. One day a mob dragged her from her chariot. They killed her in the street and destroyed her work. The church said nothing. And these aren't just isolated tragedies. This was a pattern, a system. Galileo was forced to deny what he knew about the solar system. Giordano Bruno was burned alive for daring to say the universe might be infinite. Even Da Vinci had to hide many of his ideas in coded notebooks, and backwards writing to stay safe. Why? Because curiosity is powerful. It leads to invention, to doubt, to independence. And the church feared what might happen if people started trusting their own minds more than their priests. So they created rules, not just laws but social pressure. If you asked too many questions, you were labelled difficult, dangerous. If you explored beyond what was allowed, you were accused of heresy. And heresy was a word that could end your life. Schools were designed to train obedience, not wonder. Universities were controlled by church-approved texts. Science had to fit inside theology. Anything outside that was labelled magic or madness. The worst part? It worked. For generations, brilliant minds stayed quiet, or left Europe, or destroyed their own notes out of fear. The brightest flames were snuffed out before they could catch fire. And what did we lose? How many inventions died with their creators? How many questions went unanswered because asking them was too risky? This war wasn't fought with banners or battles. It was silent, careful, and devastating. A war not just on people, but on progress, on imagination, on the simple act of wondering what else might be true. They called it a rebirth, a golden age, the Renaissance. A time when art exploded and science bloomed and human potential was celebrated like never before. But the truth is stranger, because much of what we call new during the Renaissance wasn't new at all. It was old, ancient, forgotten, or more accurately hidden. And when it returned, it was carefully staged as a rediscovery, not a resurrection of the forbidden. Imagine locking away the secrets of the universe in a dark vault for centuries. Then, one day slowly, one by one, you unlock them again. But you don't say where they came from. You don't admit you had them all along. Instead, you present them as surprises, as miracles of the moment. That's what the church did. That's what made the Renaissance possible. Ancient Greek texts, Roman philosophy, Arabic mathematics, knowledge that had been banned or buried or simply never translated during the so-called Dark Ages suddenly reappeared. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci started sketching human anatomy with shocking detail. Astronomers began mapping the heavens more accurately than ever before. Architects built domes that mirrored the stars and machines that echoed ancient mechanics. But this wave of knowledge didn't come out of nowhere. Much of it had been preserved in secret libraries, hidden in monasteries, smuggled from Islamic scholars who had protected ancient texts while Europe burned them. Some had even been locked in the very Vatican archives that once called them dangerous. And yet, when they re-emerged, the church spun the story. This wasn't about forbidden knowledge returning. This was progress, a gift from God, a sign that the faithful were ready for more light. That was the narrative. But the real story was more uncomfortable. It was about control, about timing. Because if you control when knowledge is released, you also control how it's received. Release it too early, and people might question the church. Release it after centuries of silence, and you can shape the reaction. Guide it, even take credit for it. That's why the Renaissance was filled with saints and crosses and biblical themes, even as it explored humanism and science. The church didn't fight this new age. It adapted, claimed it, decorated it with scripture. That way, it could ride the wave without being drowned by it. And the thinkers of the time, they had to play along. Galileo still had to apologize. Copernicus waited until his death to publish his most important work. Artists hid their real meanings in layers of symbols, because the rebirth was only allowed as long as it didn't challenge the people who had once buried the womb. So was the Renaissance real? Yes. But it wasn't as spontaneous as the history books suggest. It was managed, curated, lit like a stage play. A careful unveiling of truths the world was told it had forgotten, but that some had never truly let go of. And when you look at it like that, the Renaissance becomes something else entirely. Not just a rebirth, but a return. A return of what was once forbidden dressed up as a celebration, a controlled awakening. And proof that even light can be managed by those who once ruled with shadows. It's easy to believe the Renaissance was the moment the lights came on, that Europe suddenly woke up from a long sleep and remembered how to paint, how to think, how to dream again. That art exploded from nowhere, and science was born overnight. But what if that light wasn't new? What if it had always been there, just hidden behind heavy doors, guarded by silent men in robes? The theory is simple, but powerful. The Renaissance wasn't a beginning, it was a performance, a carefully timed reveal. The Vatican and the elites didn't just discover ancient wisdom, they decided when to show it. They controlled the curtain, and they made sure the audience only saw what they were ready to see. Look at the timing. For centuries, knowledge was hoarded. Ancient Greek philosophy, Egyptian math, Arabic medicine, locked in vaults or dismissed as heresy. Anyone who tried to explore it was punished. And then suddenly, one day it was okay, encouraged even, but only certain parts, only the pieces that fit a new version of the story. Leonardo da Vinci paints flying machines and dissected corpses, but his notebooks are hidden for hundreds of years. Copernicus redraws the universe, but waits until his deathbed to publish. Artists slip secret messages into frescoes. Philosophers write in code. Why? Because they still feared the very power that now claimed to celebrate their work. The church didn't lose control, it changed strategy. Instead of burning every idea that threatened its grip, it began choosing which ideas to let through, which inventions could serve the institution, which discoveries could be framed as gifts from God instead of challenges to doctrine. And, by doing so, it shaped the narrative. People believed they were moving forward, but in truth, they were only catching up to what had been kept from them. The so-called Age of Enlightenment was lit with candles that had been burning in basements for centuries. This wasn't about giving people freedom, it was about managing awakening. If truth comes too fast, it can spark rebellion. But if it's released slowly, it feels like progress, like growth, like history unfolding as it should, when in reality, the script had already been written. There are stories of inventions buried before they could change the world, of scrolls that vanished from public record only to reappear with edits, of astronomers forced to teach the stars in whispers, all while the Renaissance marched on, dressed in gold and praise and divine approval. It looked like a celebration, but it was a reveal, the kind where the magician shows you what he wants you to see, while hiding the real trick in plain sight. The light had always been there, in pyramids, in scrolls, in songs passed down by those who remembered. It was never lost, only delayed, only controlled. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not that we were kept in the dark, but that the light was right there all along, and we were taught not to look for it until someone else told us it was safe. History is more than stories, it is power. The people who control the past shape how we think about the present and what we believe is possible in the future. And no one has guarded the past more tightly than the Vatican. Behind stone walls and red robes lies a vault of memory, a carefully edited version of time. And through that control, the Church hasn't just shaped what we remember, it has shaped what we become. Think about it. If you grow up learning that your ancestors lived in darkness until a divine light arrived, you see the Church as the source of truth. If you're taught that questioning holy stories led to disaster or punishment, you stay silent. If you believe that miracles, not minds, made the world better, you stop searching for answers on your own. That's how shaping the past shapes the future. Not through force, through story. The Vatican doesn't need to rewrite every page of history. It only needs to pick which ones we're allowed to read and which ones disappear. Whole civilizations can vanish in the space between two lines of scripture. Ideas that once changed the world can be erased by calling them pagan or heretical. Suddenly, what was once fact becomes myth, and myth becomes sin. But it goes deeper. When you control the timeline, you control momentum. The Church decided when the Dark Ages began and when they ended. It decided what counted as progress and what counted as danger. Entire centuries may have been invented or removed to make its rise seem smoother, more inevitable. That's not just historical editing, that's time travel. Not with machines, but with ink and fear. And once that version of history is accepted, it becomes reality. Generations grow up thinking that the Church saved civilization, not that it helped stall it. That it was the center of learning, not the gatekeeper of forbidden knowledge. And from that belief comes obedience. We build futures based on what we think is possible. If we believe the greatest thinkers were saints and priests, we aim to serve religion. If we believe the best inventions came after divine approval, we wait for permission. But what if the truth is that many of the greatest minds were crushed before they could rise? What if the future we were promised was built on ruins of better paths? The Vatican guards more than relics. It guards narrative, memory, the lines we draw between right and wrong, sacred and profane. And the further back it controls those lines, the more influence it has on where we go next. Because if you can convince a civilization that it came from darkness, then you can decide what light looks like. And if you decide what light looks like, then you can make sure it always shines on you. So the question is not just what the Church hid, it's why. Because the past isn't dead, it's the foundation of tomorrow. And whoever guards that past guards the gate to the future. The Vatican prides itself on being the oldest continuous institution in the world, a line of spiritual leaders stretching back over 2,000 years, pope after pope, unbroken through war plague and empire collapse. But what if that line is not as solid as we've been told? What if some of those popes were never real at all? Hidden deep in church, records are strange gaps, blank spaces in timelines, conflicting names, popes who ruled at the same time, or popes who existed only in documents that surfaced centuries later. And when you dig deeper, it starts to feel less like a mistake and more like a pattern, like someone was patching holes in history to keep the story smooth. One of the strangest examples is the period around the so-called Dark Ages. Records get thin. Dates don't line up. Some popes have no trace outside of a single Vatican list. No letters, no coins, no writings, just a name on parchment. And in some cases, those names seem to exist only to fill a gap, as if continuity mattered more than truth. But why would the Church invent a pope? Because continuity equals authority. If you can prove your power never broke, you can claim it never needs to be questioned. A chain of succession means you were always right, always chosen, always blessed. Break that chain, and people start asking dangerous questions. Who ruled during the missing years? Who guided the faithful when there was no pope? And if the Church survived without a leader, was a leader ever truly necessary? To avoid those questions, the record had to be perfect, seamless, unbroken, even if that meant smoothing out the rough edges of time, even if that meant inserting a few convenient names. Some historians point to the phantom time hypothesis as a clue, the theory that hundreds of years were added to the calendar by a few rulers who wanted to rewrite history. And if time was tampered with, so was the Church's leadership. Popes may have been added to fill in those extra centuries, their stories built from fragments of other lives, their names designed to match holy patterns. Other gaps are hidden under politics. Times when rival popes claimed the same seat. Times when corruption forced records to vanish. Rather than admit confusion, the Church sometimes wrote over the chaos with simplicity. One pope, one name, no questions. Even today, the official list of popes includes men who are barely mentioned anywhere else. Their reigns short, their actions unknown, and yet they are counted as real, as vital, as part of the sacred chain. But when the chain is forged from silence and edits, how strong is it really? The idea of phantom popes isn't about blaming individuals. It's about understanding how power protects itself, even from the truth. Because, in a system built on legacy, even a crack in the foundation can bring everything down. And so the illusion of continuity must be preserved, even if it means inventing ghosts to keep the throne warm. All across Europe, locked in golden boxes and glass coffins, lie the bones of saints, skulls in velvet, fingers in gold, entire skeletons resting under stained glass windows. They are symbols of holiness, reminders of miracles, proof that the divine once walked among us. But what if some of these sacred relics belong to people who never existed? For centuries, the Vatican has controlled the process of declaring someone a saint. They decide who is worthy, who performed miracles, who died for the right reasons. But many of the earliest saints were canonized before any real system existed. No documentation, no investigation, just legends passed down by word of mouth, often centuries after the person supposedly lived. Some of these saints have no birth records, no writings, no grave. Their bones show up in distant lands with no explanation. Their stories change from one region to another, and yet they are venerated, prayed to, paraded through streets. Why would the Church create saints that might not be real? Because saints are tools. They build identity. They shape local traditions. They make people feel connected to heaven. And more importantly, they can be placed in strategic spots to give the Church deeper control. Imagine a village where people still cling to old gods. Now imagine sending in a story of a saint who once walked their land, healed their sick, and converted their ancestors. Suddenly, the village isn't pagan anymore. It has a holy past, a Christian identity, even if that story was never true. This happened again and again during the expansion of the Church. Old shrines became churches. Old festivals were renamed after saints, and the saints themselves were sometimes assembled from pieces. A miracle from one place, a martyrdom from another, a name that sounded just right. The result was a figure who felt ancient and holy, even if no one could prove they ever lived. Then there are the relics. Sacred bones sold and traded and swapped like divine currency. In medieval times, churches competed for them because a relic meant power. Pilgrims would come, money would flow, and the Church could point to the bone in the glass case and say, "Look, proof of God's work." But scholars have tested some of these bones, and they don't match the stories. A saint said to be a child turns out to be an adult. A skull said to belong to one person matches another entirely. In one famous case, multiple churches claimed to have the same saint's head, each one displayed with pride, each one authenticated by faith not fact. And through all of this, the church kept its grip on the timeline, on the narrative. Each new saint added another thread to the great tapestry of holy history. A curated version of the past, where every miracle confirmed the present and every martyr justified the rules. So maybe the question isn't how many saints were real. Maybe it's why the church needed so many in the first place. Because when you're building a sacred empire, nothing holds it together better than a few bones, a few stories, and the belief that someone somewhere once walked the path you're now told to follow. For most of history, the stars were the one thing no one could control. They moved with perfect silence and unshakable order. You could lie about kings or empires or even time itself, but the stars didn't care. They told the truth whether you liked it or not, and for a few brave astronomers, that truth was too dangerous to leave unspoken. So they vanished. Not all at once. Not with fire or trials like Galileo. Some just disappeared from the records. Their writings destroyed, their names scrubbed, their discoveries never published. But their crime was the same. They looked up and realized something wasn't right. The timeline we were told to believe didn't match the one written in the sky. Because when you track the heavens, you can measure time, eclipses, comets, planetary alignments. All of them move on precise schedules. And some of these astronomers began to notice gaps, events that didn't line up with the official history, stars recorded where they shouldn't have been, celestial events that were either missing from the past or strangely duplicated. It was like someone had added or erased years, and the sky was trying to call them out. That's when the trouble started. One German researcher in the late 1600s reportedly found ancient star charts that didn't match known timelines. He began to publish questions. His last letter mentioned a visit from church officials. After that, he was never seen again. No body, no records, just a footnote in a forgotten library. Another case involved a monk in Italy who built his own observatory. He compared lunar cycles to early church records and found something strange. The dates of major events didn't align. His letters stopped coming. His observatory was dismantled. His papers vanished. Coincidence? Maybe, but it keeps happening. From Spain to Bohemia to Poland, people who studied the stars too closely and dared to challenge the calendar became problems. And problems had a way of being handled quietly. Because if the church's timeline was false, it meant their authority was too. The Pope's divine link, the dates of miracles, the holy anniversaries that tied faith to heaven. It could all unravel if the stars proved otherwise. So silence became the solution. The Vatican claimed to support astronomy. And in public they did. They built observatories, funded star maps, but only when the findings matched the narrative. Only when the stars obeyed, the calendar already approved. Those who stepped outside that were branded heretics. Or worse, they were simply forgotten. Their names left out of textbooks. Their findings lost in floods, or fires, or unexplained disappearances. And yet the stars remain, quiet, watching, unchanging. Some believe those missing astronomers knew too much, that their work was buried in the archives beneath Rome, that somewhere deep in the vaults are charts that rewrite everything we thought we knew about history, about time, about power. Because in the end, it wasn't the stars that betrayed the church. It was the ones who dared to read them. Beneath the streets of Vatican City lies a place few have ever seen, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It's guarded by thick walls, strict rules, and more than 50 miles of shelves. It holds centuries of letters, papal decrees, ancient texts, and locked secrets. But that's just the surface. Because according to whispers from insiders, historians, and even ex-priests, there's more. A second layer. A hidden vault beneath the vaults. A place so restricted, even most cardinals aren't allowed to know it exists. They say it's where the real secrets are kept. The ones that can't be explained away or denied. Not dusty scrolls or forgotten kings, but writings that rewrite the past, maps that show lands that shouldn't exist, devices that don't belong to their time, books that speak of angels, not as spirits, but as beings of light with knowledge, beyond anything known. Some even believe it holds proof of other civilizations, ones erased not by time, but by decision. There are rumours of a black corridor hidden behind a false wall in the archive's deepest section, that you can only access it with a key held by the Superior General of the Jesuits, that even most popes never see what lies beyond. And if they do, they're sworn into a silence deeper than any vow. It's not just conspiracy theorists who talk about this. Former scholars who worked in the archives have described entire rooms sealed off. Guards posted without explanation. Documents with entries in the catalogue, but no physical location. And requests that vanish into silence. The deeper vault is where inconvenient truths go to disappear. Early Christian texts that challenge the official gospel. Ancient accounts of beings descending from the sky long before the Bible was written. Writings from civilizations wiped from the timeline. Even first-hand reports of miracles that sound more like advanced technology than divine intervention. And here's the most chilling part. It's not just about hiding history, it's about controlling what comes next. Because if the past is full of knowledge that could change everything, who decides when the world is ready? Or if it's ever ready at all? The Church has always claimed to guard knowledge for the good of humanity. But who decides what's good? Who gets to choose what we're allowed to remember? There's a saying among archivists: the most important thing in a library isn't the books on the shelves, it's the ones that aren't there. And in the case of the Vatican, the ones that aren't there might be locked under miles of stone behind gates no one admits exist, guarded by a silence older than empires. Because if the rumours are true, the greatest secrets of human history aren't lost. They're waiting, in the vaults beneath the vaults. Somewhere deep in the forgotten corners of ancient history lie books that were never meant to be read, not because they were dangerous to the soul, but because they were dangerous to the story. These are not wild prophecies or strange poetry. These are detailed accounts of gods, cities, machines, and knowledge that existed long before the Church, long before the Bible. And if they are real, they could tear open the timeline we've been taught since birth. These books tell a different version of the beginning. They speak of great floods that weren't punishments, but resets. Of towers that reached the sky, not in arrogance, but in understanding. Of travellers from the stars who walked among men, teaching them how to read the heavens and harness the elements. And most terrifying of all, they suggest that the stories in the Bible may not be original, that they may be edited retellings of much older truths. One of the most whispered about texts is the Book of Enoch. Once read alongside the early Hebrew scriptures, it describes angels descending to earth, teaching forbidden knowledge, and even creating giants. It was removed from the Bible centuries ago, declared too strange, too dangerous, too close to something the Church couldn't explain. Then there are the Sumerian tablets, which mention a group of beings called the Anunnaki. They weren't spirits or metaphors. They were rulers, scientists, builders, and their stories predate Genesis by thousands of years. Yet you'll never hear about them in Sunday school. Other manuscripts found in caves or buried beneath ruins tell of miracles that sound like science, of wars in the sky, of voices that came not from clouds, but from machines. They use language that feels impossible for their time, descriptions that align more with modern technology than ancient myth. The Vatican has had access to many of these texts. Through conquests, excavations, and secret donations, the Church has gathered pieces of a puzzle it refuses to complete. Scholars who attempt to study them often find themselves silenced, their work discredited, their research buried, because if these books are accepted as true, then everything shifts. The Bible becomes one version of a much older narrative. The Church loses its place as the keeper of ultimate truth. And people might start asking the one question the Vatican cannot afford. What else have we been told is divine when it was simply misunderstood? This is not about destroying faith. It's about asking who built the foundation and what they chose to leave out. The books that could undo the Bible are not myths. They are histories, not perfect or pure, but filled with echoes of forgotten ages. And perhaps that's why they were hidden, not because they lie, but because they remember. And in a world built on selective memory, remembering the wrong thing can be the most dangerous act of all. Stone doesn't speak, but it remembers. While books can be burned and scrolls rewritten, stone lasts. It watches centuries go by holding on to secrets in silence. And sometimes, if you look close enough, it whispers. Beneath cathedrals, behind altars, under layers of dust and candle soot, are messages carved into walls, symbols hidden in plain sight, and designs that say something very different from the official story. Some of these whispers are found in ancient churches, in doorways that don't line up, in windows shaped like stars that have nothing to do with Christian theology, in floor patterns that match constellations, not scripture. Architects will say it's just art, just old styles. But others believe these choices were deliberate, codes left behind by those who knew the truth but couldn't speak it out loud. Take, for example, certain spiral staircases that mirror the golden ratio, or cathedral ceilings that align perfectly with solstices and equinoxes. These buildings weren't just made to honour God. They were built to track time, to hold knowledge, to preserve information that the Church tried to erase from books. There are places where saints are carved with strange tools in their hands, or halos shaped like suns and stars. There are murals where angels wear robes, covered in what looks like mathematical formulas, where demons are shown holding keys, books, or globes, almost like they weren't evil at all, just keepers of knowledge the Church didn't want people touching. And it gets weirder. Across Europe and the Middle East, there are temples and chapels with carvings of ships sailing through the sky, of beings with wings made not of feathers but metal, of towers that shoot beams into the heavens. These images don't fit the stories we're told. They don't belong in a world where miracles only happen through prayer. But they exist, quiet, waiting. Some of the most mysterious symbols are found in places connected to the Knights Templar and early Freemasons. Geometric designs, crosses within crosses, labyrinths without exits. These were not just decorations. They were puzzles, maps, silent warnings, or invitations to remember what once was. Even grave markers in old monasteries hold strange details. Eyes with no pupils, keys held upside down, serpents that twist into numbers. It's as if the dead themselves were trying to say something the living were too afraid to hear. The Vatican has always claimed to be the guardian of truth, but the stones tell a different story, one of hidden knowledge buried under centuries of obedience, one of architects and masons and monks who couldn't publish books but could carve walls, who couldn't preach what they knew but could build it into ceilings and spires. So next time you step into a cathedral, look up, look around. The truth might not be on the altar, it might be in the floor beneath your feet or the shadow on the wall. Because in a world ruled by silence, the oldest secrets don't scream, they whisper in stone. Imagine waking up one day and finding out it's not the year you thought it was. Not by a few months, or even a few years, but by almost 3 centuries. That's the heart of one of the strangest and most ignored theories in history. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. And if it's true, it would mean that nearly 300 years of our past never actually happened. The idea comes from a German historian named Heribert Illig, who in the 1990s looked at the records of the early Middle Ages and noticed something strange. Between roughly the years 614 and 911 AD, everything seemed off. Architecture barely changed, art styles froze. There were fewer records, fewer discoveries, fewer conflicts. It was like the world hit pause. Illig proposed something shocking. Those years didn't happen. Someone added 297 fake years into the calendar. Entire centuries of fake emperors, fake battles, fake popes. The big question is why? According to the theory, it started with a powerful ruler named Otto III. He wanted to rule during the year 1000 because it sounded holy, important, like a number blessed by God. But the real year was more like 703. So with help from the church and a few scholars, Otto pushed the timeline forward. Just like that, nearly 3 centuries were invented and written into the books. And the church had every reason to agree. With those years added, they could shape the story, fill in the gaps, create saints and popes and councils that fit the theology they wanted to protect. It wasn't just a lie about time. It was a rewrite of everything people believed. But how could they get away with it? Because back then, only a few people could read. Even fewer could keep records. The ones who did worked for the church. They were the historians, the timekeepers, the scribes. If they all agreed on a new calendar, who would argue? Critics say it's impossible, that archaeology and astronomy prove the years are real. But even there, the cracks show. Some buildings thought to be from the 800s have no clear construction timeline. Some star charts from that era don't match the sky. Eclipses recorded on certain dates couldn't have happened then. Something doesn't line up. And if the theory is right, the consequences are massive. It means Charlemagne, one of Europe's greatest emperors, might have been a myth, that hundreds of popes might be fiction, that wars we study in textbooks never took place, that everything built on that false time, including parts of the Bible's timeline, the Crusades, and even the rise of Islam, may have happened earlier or later than we think. Time isn't just numbers on a page, it's how we understand ourselves. It tells us who came before and who holds power now. So if nearly 300 years were faked, what else has been changed? What else have we accepted without question? Maybe the scariest part isn't that time was altered. Maybe it's that we didn't notice. And maybe we still don't. Picture a massive cathedral stretching into the sky. Every stone perfectly placed, every window glowing with coloured light, every arch echoing with quiet reverence. From the outside it looks eternal, unshakable, sacred. But what if that cathedral wasn't built on truth? What if it was made from stories carefully crafted over centuries, not to reflect reality, but to replace it. That's how some believe history itself has been shaped. Not discovered, but designed. Not grown, but constructed. A cathedral of illusion built by spiritual institutions brick by brick, to guide belief, protect power, and rewrite the past in a way that benefits the builders. The Vatican is often at the center of this theory, not just as a religious authority, but as an architect of time. Through councils and doctrines, through saints and miracles, it helped lay the foundation. Then it raised the walls with carefully chosen books, carved time into shape with official calendars, and polished the windows with myths that made people feel safe. And once it was finished, people were invited in, taught to walk its halls, to look up in awe and never question the stones beneath their feet. But behind every sacred statue is a choice someone made. Behind every timeline is a date that was accepted, not discovered. And in the silence of its vaulted ceilings, you can almost hear the whispers of the stories that didn't make it into the design. Stories that were too strange, too ancient, or too dangerous to be allowed inside. This cathedral was not built in a day. It took generations of scribes, councils, emperors, and popes. And it wasn't built with hammers and nails, but with silence, repetition, and the careful erasure of anything that didn't fit the blueprint. Texts were burned, gospels were buried, thinkers were condemned. Not to punish sin, but to protect structure. Because once the illusion is complete, it becomes harder to question. You grow up inside it. You measure truth by its walls. You trust its architects. Even if something feels off, the beauty of the place makes you doubt yourself. You tell yourself, it must be true, because it's lasted so long, because everyone agrees, because to doubt, it feels like heresy. But there are cracks. Ancient texts that tell different versions of the beginning. Astronomical records that break the calendar. Maps that show lands no one should have known. They don't destroy the cathedral, but they make the walls tremble. And maybe that's the real fear. Not that the cathedral is evil, but that it's fragile. That the whole structure depends on people not looking too closely, not asking the wrong questions, not digging beneath the marble to find what was buried in the foundation. So next time you stand in awe of a grand story told by those in power, remember this. Even the most beautiful cathedral can be built on sand. And sometimes the truth is not in the light pouring through stained glass. It's in the shadows it leaves behind. There's a strange pattern in history, not just in the past, but in the people who try to uncover it. You'd think that historians digging for truth would be celebrated, encouraged, protected. But sometimes the exact opposite happens. They get ignored, laughed at, fired, or worse. It's like the deeper they dig, the more invisible they become, like something doesn't want the truth to come out. They call it the historian's curse. It doesn't strike the ones who repeat the official story. It waits for the curious, the ones who ask why the calendar changed without a clear reason, why certain gospels were erased, why astronomical records don't match the years we're told to believe. The moment they find something too real, too raw, too disruptive, their careers start to fall apart. It usually begins small. A rejected paper, a strange silence from publishers. Then come the whispers, other scholars pulling away, universities cutting funding. Suddenly, someone who spent years studying is seen as a joke. A conspiracy theorist, not because they lied, but because they found something inconvenient. Take the case of a man who questioned the traditional dating of the early Middle Ages. He wasn't crazy. He had charts, artifacts, and records to back him up. But his work was dismissed, not debated. Conferences stopped inviting him. Journals refused to print his name. His books were buried under a wave of official disapproval. Another tried to publish translations of ancient texts that hinted at civilizations far older than the Bible suggested. He found parallels between myths from different continents, stories that lined up too well to be coincidence. The response? His university forced him to resign, accused him of academic fraud. No proof, just pressure. Even today, there are researchers studying the Vatican archives who describe being followed, watched, having digital files disappear. Not by hackers, but by internal systems. Access revoked. Doors that were once open, now permanently shut. It's not always a dramatic purge. It doesn't need to be. Most of the time, the curse works quietly. It isolates. It exhausts. It makes the historian feel crazy until they give up. Or worse, until no one listens, even when they're right. That's the real power of the curse. It doesn't have to kill the truth. It just needs to make sure no one hears it. And the church? It rarely responds. It doesn't have to. The silence is loud enough. The structure protects itself. Because in a world where information is power, the most dangerous person isn't the one who screams lies. It's the one who whispers something real. So, next time you hear about a forgotten scholar, a banned book, a theory that vanished, ask yourself why. Maybe they were wrong, or maybe they just saw too much. And maybe truth isn't erased all at once. Maybe it's buried scholar by scholar, page by page one, silenced voice at a time. It's easy to imagine the Vatican's greatest fear as some violent uprising torches at the gates or angry crowds demanding justice. But that's not it. That's never been it. The real fear is quieter, slower, more powerful. It's curiosity. Not wild rebellion. Just questions. Simple ones. Like, why does the Church own the world's largest private archive of forbidden books? Why were some Gospels erased? Why are there maps showing lands no one should have known? What if we've been taught a version of history that was edited, cleaned, and polished until it served the right story? That's what terrifies them. Not riots, but readers. Not swords, but thoughts. Because once you start asking those questions, you begin to see the cracks. In the timeline, in the saints, in the miracles. You realize some dates don't match. Some stories repeat. Some truths were never lost. They were locked away. The Vatican spent centuries building a version of the world. One where everything made sense, where every event was part of a divine plan. But real history isn't that neat. It's messy, full of contradictions, forgotten texts, and strange overlaps. And the moment people begin to notice, the silence starts to tremble. The real danger to the Church isn't heresy. It's curiosity without fear. People who aren't trying to destroy anything, just trying to understand it for themselves. People who don't need permission to wonder. That's the kind of awakening that can't be stopped once it starts. Because curiosity spreads. It jumps from friend to friend, post to post, video to video. One person reads an old gospel, the next asks why it's not in the Bible. Another studies ancient architecture and notices things no one taught them in school. Someone else stumbles across a theory about missing years or erased inventions, and instead of laughing, they pause. That pause is everything. The Vatican has seen this before. During the Renaissance, when forgotten knowledge began to return. During the printing revolution, when books reached people who were never meant to read. And every time the story started to slip from their hands, they found a way to pull it back. Ban a book, silence a voice, rewrite a date. But today, it's harder. There are more cracks in the wall than ever. The archive is too big to guard. The people are too connected to contain. And maybe that's what scares them the most. That the next person to find a missing piece won't be a priest or a historian. It'll be you, in your room, at night, watching, reading, asking, not to burn it all down, just to understand what was really there. Before the edits, before the silence, before the fear, and in that quiet moment of curiosity, the whole illusion begins to shift. Because the most powerful revolution doesn't start with a scream, it starts with a question. Some truths don't explode, they echo, quietly. They live not in headlines or revolutions, but in forgotten corners and sealed vaults. They don't need to be shouted to be dangerous, they just need to exist. The Vatican has spent centuries perfecting the art of silence. Not denial, not lies, just silence. A missing book, a sealed archive, a name no longer mentioned, a year that somehow vanished from the records. And in that silence, the most powerful truths are buried, not because they're loud, but because they would force the world to stop and think. Think about what really happened. Not everything in history needed to be erased with fire. Sometimes it was enough to close a door and never open it again. A manuscript stored too deep to reach. A gospel translated once and then never again. A scroll declared unworthy of canon not because it was false, but because it said too much. The Vatican didn't have to destroy everything. They just had to wait. They knew the world would move on, that people forget what they're told not to ask about. That silence isn't questioned if it's wrapped in ceremony. And what's still hidden in that silence? Fragments, pieces of a different story, mentions of a time before the Bible's beginning, descriptions of beings who looked human but came from the stars, machines mistaken for miracles, knowledge that suggests time didn't move the way we're told it did, maps that show places no one should have known, bones that don't match our species. These aren't theories meant to entertain, they are shards, scattered remains of something that was broken deliberately. And the most disturbing part? The Church doesn't deny them. It doesn't even mention them. They just sit in silence, locked in temperature-controlled vaults beneath the earth. Protected not by guards with guns, but by paperwork, delays by tradition, by distraction. Because silence doesn't argue. It just waits for you to stop looking. But some people never stopped. Scholars, explorers, priests with questions. They saw glimpses. A banned book here, an uncatalogued relic there. Notes in margins that speak of events outside the timeline. And then they vanished. Or their findings did. Or both. The truth is not a single story. It's a puzzle. And the missing pieces are locked in places where the world doesn't look. Not because they are violent, but because they are undeniable. Because if those fragments saw daylight, the questions they would raise could undo centuries of faith, reshape our understanding of where we came from, and destroy the illusion that history has been settled. So they remain in silence. For now, but silence is not forever. Even in the deepest vaults the truth waits, and it only takes one spark of curiosity to turn quiet into revelation. Because the most dangerous truth is not the one that shouts, it's the one that was never allowed to speak. There is a kind of light that doesn't come from the sun. It doesn't shine from stained glass windows or golden altars. It's the light that flickers on the edge of memory when you start to question. When you start to remember something you were never supposed to notice. This whole journey hasn't been about proving one theory or exposing a single secret. It's been about peeling back layers, about asking who built the version of history we're taught, and why they left so many pages blank. why some names were erased, why some truths were buried under silence so thick it swallowed whole centuries. But now you've seen what most never will. Not just cracks in the story, but the pattern behind the cracks. The way power protects itself. The way knowledge is filtered like sunlight through heavy curtains. And the way the Vatican over centuries became the keeper not only of faith, but of memory itself. You've heard the whispers of the missing Gospels, the strange calendars, the vanished stars, the forbidden books, the saints with no bones, the popes who might never have lived. And maybe none of it proves anything on its own, but together they form a shadow, a shape, a warning, that we are not meant to know everything. But what if that's exactly why we should try? Because truth isn't fragile, it doesn't need permission, it just needs to be seen. And maybe the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight or shout or argue. Maybe it's to look closely, quietly, patiently, to read the old maps, to ask what the stars were really telling, to wonder why some knowledge was called heresy and some was wrapped in gold and declared sacred, to see the light that was never meant to reach you. The church feared that light. So did emperors, kings and scribes. Not because it would cause chaos, but because it would cause thought. And thought is dangerous. It cannot be chained. It cannot be silenced forever. And now it lives in you. Not just the questions, but the will to keep asking. To wonder what else has been forgotten. What else was edited out. So remember this. Every great lie needs silence to survive. Every truth waits in the dark for someone to care enough to bring it back. And remembering is not rebellion, it's freedom. So let the light in. Let it touch the corners of your mind that school never reached. Let it guide your curiosity down strange paths and old ruins and dusty pages. Because the truth was never gone. It was just hidden. And now that you've seen even a glimpse of it, there's no going back. Only forward, into the past, where all the secrets were buried, waiting for you